We are tracking a storm system that's about to cause some serious problems for a huge chunk of the country. And I mean that in almost every way a storm can cause problems. We've got damaging winds, we've got large hail, we've got a tornado threat, and on top of all of that, we've got a flooding rainfall threat that's going to linger for days. This is shaping up to be one of the more complicated setups we've had in a while because it's not just one round of storms and then you're done. This is a multi-day, multi-wave event, and depending on where you live, you could be dealing with a completely different hazard than the town right next to you. So let's not waste any time and get right into it because there's a lot to cover. Let's start with today, because today is really where this whole system starts to wake up. Right now, we've got a broken line of showers and a few weak thunderstorms out ahead of the main system, mostly across the interior. That's not the story yet. The story is what happens once the main energy swings through later this afternoon and into tonight. As that upper-level disturbance digs in, we're going to see explosive development along and ahead of the leading edge, and I think by mid to late afternoon we could have a solid line of strong to severe thunderstorms stretching across a pretty wide area. The Storm Prediction Center has a good chunk of the region under an enhanced risk today, and within that enhanced risk there's a smaller area where I think the wind threat is going to be the standout hazard. We're talking gusts of 60 to 70 miles an hour in the strongest cells, and if any of these storms can organize into a bow echo, which I think is fairly likely by this evening, you could see a fairly long swath of damaging wind reports stacking up from west to east. Hail is also part of today's story, and I don't want anyone to overlook that. With the amount of instability building in ahead of this system, I would not be surprised to see a few reports of hail in the golf ball to tennis ball. Range, especially with any storm that manages to stay discrete for a little while before getting absorbed into the larger cluster. Those discrete cells are also going to be the ones to watch for tornadoes. I don't think this is going to be a widespread tornado outbreak kind of day, but there is enough turning in the atmosphere, enough directional shear layered on top of decent instability, that a couple of these storms could produce a brief tornado, and in a worst case scenario, something a little stronger than brief. So if you're in that zone later today, this is not a day to ignore the sirens or the alerts on your phone. Timing-wise, I think the first storms fire up right around the noon hour in the western part of the threat area, and then things really start to ramp up between about 3 and 6 in the afternoon as the line consolidates and pushes east. By the time we get into the evening hours, say 7 to 10, this should be a fairly continuous line moving through, and that's usually when the wind threat becomes the most widespread because the line itself starts to feed off its own outflow. After about 10 or 11 at night, I do expect things to gradually weaken, but I wouldn't be shocked if a few leftover cells hang on well past midnight in the far eastern extent of the threat area, especially if the line runs into any lingering instability. Now here's the thing that makes this system so tricky. This isn't a one-and-done event. As soon as today's line pushes through, we're already watching the next piece of energy that's going to swing in behind it, and that's going to set up round 2 for tomorrow. Tomorrow's threat looks like it's going to shift a little bit compared to today, sliding generally to the north and east of where today's worst weather sets up. I think the corridor most at risk tomorrow stretches from the interior plains back into the upper Midwest, and once again, damaging wind is going to be the headline hazard. We could see gusts up to around 65 miles an hour out of the strongest storms, with a secondary threat of large hail, especially during the earlier stages of development before everything grows upscale into more of a line. The tornado threat tomorrow, I think, is a little bit lower than today, but it's not zero. If we get any storms that can stay isolated for even 30 to 45 minutes before merging with their neighbors, those are the ones that could spin up something quick. I'd keep an eye on the late afternoon and early evening hours tomorrow as the most likely window for that kind of activity. Now let's talk about what happens after that, because this is where things get even more serious. Heading into the following day, we're watching for what could be the most significant piece of this whole system. A stronger area of low pressure is expected to deepen as it lifts northeast, and that's going to drag a very potent cold front through the eastern half of the country. Ahead of that front, we're going to have several hours of very warm, very humid air sitting in place, and that's exactly the kind of setup that can lead to a high-end severe weather day if everything comes together the way the models are currently suggesting. Right now, I think there's a reasonable chance that day gets upgraded to a moderate risk of severe weather in at least part of the threat area, and if that happens, that tells you this is not a normal severe weather day. That's a day where you want to have your plan already figured out well before storms are anywhere close to you. The combination of strong wind shear and steep, low-level lapse rates could support not just isolated tornadoes, but potentially a cluster of supercells capable of producing strong, long-track tornadoes in a worst-case scenario. I want to stress that there's still some uncertainty in exactly where that highest threat sets up, because small shifts in the track of the low-pressure system can shift the entire severe weather corridor by 100 miles or more. But the ingredients are there, and that's why I'm flagging this one so far in advance. Alongside that tornado and wind threat, we also can't ignore the hail potential on that day. With the amount of instability forecast to build in, I wouldn't be surprised to see hail up to baseball size out of the strongest, most persistent supercells. That kind of hail can do serious damage to roofs, vehicles, and crops. So even if you're not in the bullseye for the tornado threat, you could still be dealing with a very costly hail event. Once that system finally clears out, which I think happens by the following morning, we should get a brief lull. Behind the front, temperatures are going to drop noticeably, and that cooler, drier air should shut down the severe weather threat for at least a day or two across most of the area that just got hit. That's good news, because it gives everyone a chance to clean up, assess any damage, and take a breath before we have to start talking about the next system. And unfortunately, there is a next system, because behind this cooler air, we're already watching another disturbance organize out west. And that one looks like it wants to redevelop severe weather back across the plains by the middle of next week. It's still too early to nail down exact details on that one, since we're now getting into the range where the various computer models start to disagree quite a bit. But given how active this pattern has been, I would not be surprised if this becomes another multi-day stretch of severe weather once it arrives. I'll have more on that as we get closer and the models start to come into better agreement. Now let's shift gears for a moment, because severe thunderstorms are not the only concern we're tracking. Down along the Gulf Coast, we've got a broad area of low pressure that has been slowly trying to get better organized over the past 24 to 48 hours. The National Hurricane Center has been watching the system closely, and the latest odds put the chance of this developing into at least a tropical depression somewhere in the range of 40 to 50% over the next several days. It's not moving very fast, which is part of the problem, because a slow-moving system sitting over warm Gulf waters has plenty of time and fuel to get better organized if the upper-level winds cooperate. Even if the system never technically becomes a named storm, it's still going to be a significant rainfall producer for parts of the Gulf Coast. Some of the computer models are showing storm total rainfall amounts in the range of 6 to 10 inches in the heaviest bands, and given how saturated the ground already is in some spots, that raises a real concern for flash flooding, especially in low-lying and urban areas where drainage can get overwhelmed quickly. If you live anywhere near the coast down there, this is one to keep an eye on regardless of whether it ever gets a name. If it does manage to strengthen into a tropical storm, the track guidance right now is fairly split. Some of the models want to lift this thing north and bring it on shore somewhere along the central Gulf Coast, while others keep it drifting more to the west before eventually curving inland. That kind of spread in the guidance tells you we're still several days out from having real confidence in exactly where the center might end up, so I wouldn't lock into any one specific outcome just yet. What I can say with more confidence is that regardless of the exact track, moisture from the system is going to get pulled northward and could interact with that severe weather system we just talked about, which could actually enhance rainfall totals even further inland than you'd normally expect. Before we wrap up, I want to go a little deeper on a few specific pieces of this setup, because I think the general overview only tells part of the story, and some of you are going to want the finer details. Let's start with today's wind threat, because I think this is going to end up being the most widely felt hazard of the entire event. When I look at the environment we're expecting this afternoon, we've got a fairly deep, well-mixed boundary layer, which basically means that strong winds a few thousand feet above the ground are going to have an easier time getting mixed down to the surface inside any storm that can produce a healthy downdraft. That's the recipe for widespread damaging wind reports, rather than just a handful of isolated ones. If the line does organize the way I expect, I wouldn't be surprised if we end up with wind damage reports scattered across several hundred miles by the time the line finally weakens tonight. Trees down, some power outages, and in the strongest cores, possible structural damage to weaker buildings like sheds, carports, and older barns. If you've got anything outside that could become a projectile in 60 or 70 mile-an-hour winds, now is the time to bring it in or secure it, not after the line is already visible on radar. On the hail side of things today, I mentioned golf ball to tennis ball size is possible, and I want to be clear about what that actually means for you. Hail in that range can crack windshields, dent vehicle panels, and shred siding and roofing material. If you've got a vehicle you can move into a garage or under a carport, I would do that sooner rather than later, especially if you live in that corridor I outlined earlier where the discrete supercells are most likely to develop before the line consolidates. Now let's dig a little more into that high-end day I flagged as the most concerning piece of this whole pattern. One of the reasons I'm watching that day so closely is the timing of the low-level jet. Overnight into that morning, we're expecting a fairly strong low-level jet to develop, and that's going to be pumping. Extremely moist, unstable air northward well before the main line of storms even arrives. That kind of setup, where the atmosphere is already primed hours before storms form, tends to produce a more volatile environment once thunderstorms do get going, because there's simply more fuel available for them to work with. It also means that if any storms manage to fire even a little bit ahead of the main line, in what we call a prefrontal environment, those storms could have an even higher tornado potential than the line itself, because they'd be feeding on air that hasn't been modified by outflow from other storms yet. I also want to touch on the timing uncertainty for that day a little more, because I don't want anyone to walk away thinking this is a lock. The exact placement of the surface low and the associated dry line or front is still shifting run to run in the models. And a shift of even 50 to 75 miles can be the difference between a town seeing the absolute worst of this event and a town seeing almost nothing at all. That's just the nature of forecasting severe weather several days out. What doesn't shift much, though, is the overall ingredients being in place somewhere in that broader corridor. Switching back to the tropical system for a moment, I want to give a little more context on why the slow movement is such a big deal. When a disturbance sits over warm Gulf water for an extended period, without much steering flow to push it along, it essentially gets to for an hour or two and then moves on. A slow mover can sit over the same stretch of coastline for the better part of a day, and that's when you start seeing those extreme rainfall totals that lead to significant flash flooding, even without the system ever becoming a hurricane or even a named tropical storm. So I really do want to emphasize, don't judge the threat from this system purely based on whether it gets a name. Some of the worst flooding events in recent memory have come from systems that never even reached tropical storm strength. Let's bring this all together because I know that's a lot of information to take in. Today, the main concern is damaging wind and a few embedded tornadoes as the first line of storms pushes through during the afternoon and evening. Tomorrow, the threat shifts north and east with damaging wind, once again the headline hazard, and a lower but non-zero tornado risk. The day after that is the one I'm most concerned about, with the potential for a high-end severe weather event that could include strong tornadoes, very damaging winds, and large hail, and there's a real chance part of that area gets upgraded to a moderate risk once we get a little closer. After that system clears, we get a short break before the pattern tries to redevelop severe weather out west by the middle of next week. And running alongside all of that, we've got a tropical system in the Gulf that's going to bring heavy rainfall and flooding concerns to the coast. With a real chance, it organizes further into a tropical storm. I know this is a lot of separate pieces moving at the same time, and that's exactly why I wanted to lay it all out together instead of covering it in bits and pieces. When you've got severe weather, flooding rain, and a developing tropical system all happening in the same general time frame, it's easy for people to focus on just one of those threats and completely miss the others. So if you're anywhere in the path of any of this, my advice is simple. Make sure you have a way to get warnings, even if you're asleep or away from a screen, because some of the more dangerous storms in a setup like this can develop and become tornado warned in a matter of minutes. Have a plan for where you'd go in your home if a warning were issued, and make sure everyone in your household knows that plan. And if you're along the coast watching that tropical system, don't wait until it has a name to start thinking about your rainfall and flooding risk, because the rain doesn't care whether the system officially gets named or not. I'll be keeping a close watch on all of these pieces over the next several days, and as the models continue to come into better agreement, especially on that potential high-end severe weather day, I'll have updates with more specific details on timing, exact areas most at risk, and how confident we should be in the more extreme scenarios. Weather patterns like this one don't come around all that often, with this many hazards lined up back to back, so I want to make sure everyone has enough lead time to prepare rather than finding out about it the morning of. So stay weather aware over the next several days, keep checking back for updates as this all continues to evolve, and I'll see you in the next one with the latest details on how this storm system is shaping up.